Congressman Schiff, thank you so much for joining us today on this ASP chat.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right into the questions. Congressman, you chair the House Intelligence Committee and are one of the 9 people that sit on the Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack. So can you just tell us basically what is the overall goal of the January 6th committee?
The goal of our committee is to examine and investigate all that went into that violent attack on the Capitol, with the ultimate object creating a permanent record, a comprehensive record of what happened, and a set of recommendations as to how to protect the country and our democracy going forward. So much like after the 9/11 attack, which emanated from outside the country, but obviously had a big impact on the trajectory of our nation, that commission produced a seminal work on everything that went into that attack and how to protect the country. We want to do the same thing. So we're going to be having more public hearings. We'll be writing a report, and we intend to follow the evidence wherever it leads and really do a comprehensive analysis about how lies about our election and a lot of planning went into the most significant attack on our Capitol in well over a century.
Steve Bannon, who refused to testify to the committee, was recently indicted on contempt of Congress charges. What is contempt of Congress, and what are the consequences for those who don't comply with a subpoena from the committee?
Well, much like a court, if a court subpoenas someone to appear and they don't appear, the judge can issue an arrest warrant. In Congress, we have a similar power to subpoena witnesses, and if a witness doesn't appear, we have a process that we can use where we will vote to hold them in contempt of Congress. We first vote in committee and then we vote on the floor. And we make a referral to the Justice Department for prosecution. We did that in the case of Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon simply refused to show up. And we held him in contempt, referred to the Justice Department, and they sought an indictment from a grand jury. And he was charged with 2 counts of obstruction, both carrying a potential jail sentence of up to a year, as well as fines. So that's one mechanism for enforcing our subpoenas. The Congress really can't be a Congress any more than a court could be a court if we can't enforce our oversight powers. And it has a particular significance for Congress because when we're looking into whether it's corruption in the executive branch, or in this case, a violent attack on the Congress itself, if we can't force people to answer questions, there's no way we could do our jobs.
Steve Bannon surrendered to the FBI following his indictment. So where does it go from here? What does the indictment actually mean for Bannon and potentially others?
Well, what it means for Bannon is that his failure to even appear, and when you're going to make a claim of privilege, you're required to come in person, you're required to make a specific claim of privilege as to a specific question or document. He did none of those things. He was under the impression, I think from the last 4 years, in which he had been subpoenaed to come in before Congress before, refused to answer a whole set of questions, and there was no consequence, was indicted for stealing money from people that were, he was raising it purportedly to build the wall that Mexico was supposed to pay for. He was then pardoned after those indictments. And so I think he was led to believe that he was above the law. The significance of the prosecution of Steve Bannon is an affirmation, once again, that no one is above the law, not even friends of the former president. And in terms of the impact on others, I think it's already had an impact on others. Most people are cooperating with us. Those who are not cooperating are being subpoenaed, and we expect that they will adhere to the law, and the fact that they now understand if they don't do their lawful duty, they may also be prosecuted, I think is having a very important impact on securing people's testimony and their documents.
Will the committee ask Pence, Trump, or any sitting member of Congress to testify?
We may very well do that. We haven't made a decision on that yet, but one thing we are determined to do, and this is on a very bipartisan basis, is we're going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. If it leads to questions about the role of members of Congress in that insurrection, then we will follow those leads and we will call in those members. If there are questions that we need answered by anyone at the top of the last administration, we will pursue that evidence as well. So we're starting off with a certain set of witnesses that, in terms of our investigative scope and process, makes sense to bring in first. But people should not be under the impression that we're excluding anybody, because we're not.
The courts are considering whether or not executive privilege covers the Trump administration and the campaign records the committee has subpoenaed. First off, what is executive privilege exactly, and how do you see the courts deciding this question?
Executive privilege is a doctrine that says that a president should be able to confide in some of their top aides about their job responsibilities, as well as the president's. So it's very limited to people who are top advisors of the president. It's also limited in terms of what it covers. It only covers conversations about work responsibilities. And even when it does apply, it's not absolute. And in some cases, it needs to give way to greater considerations, such as the public need to know. In the case here, the holder of the privilege is the current president. It's not a former president, it's the current president. And the current president has said that the need for the public and Congress to know what led to that attack on the Capitol is paramount. It was an attack on our democracy. And so the president has decided not to assert any executive privilege. Now, there are still some people that are refusing to testify, like Steve Bannon, but their claims have no merit. Steve Bannon wasn't working for the administration, so there is no privilege to apply. Even if there was a privilege to apply, a lot of the questions we have to ask him about are not even conversations he had with the former president. So then again, it doesn't apply. And even if there were conversations with the former president that somehow would be covered, and it's not really conceivable how that would be the case, you can't simply not show up. Your obligation is to show up when subpoenaed and say, as to this question on this basis, I'm making this claim of privilege. None of that happened, which is the reason why Mr. Bannon has been indicted.
Has the committee been able to determine if the attack on January 6th was premeditated or spontaneous?
We're looking into that particular issue. That is, how much planning went into the attack. Now, we know that certain things were well planned out in advance. One of the things that led to January 6th was this systematic campaign to undermine people's trust in the election, the propagation of the big lie. We know that there were lots of people, for example, on the mall that day who showed up wearing body armor or who had plastic hand ties as if to take people hostage, and others that had sophisticated radio equipment. We know that there was extensive presence of white nationalist groups who appear to have been well organized. And so the degree to which these actors integrated and operated with each other still remains unknown. That's one of the things that we are pursuing. But we know the Justice Department was being urged to propagate the big lie about the election. We know that the Justice Department was being urged to try to coerce states like Georgia into withholding the appointment of electors. So some of these things did require planning and preparation. Who was involved? How were they involved? How were some of these efforts related to other efforts to overturn the election? All of these things will ultimately go in our final report. So we know there is certainly some evidence of pre-planning on different elements of what led to January 6th, but we don't have the complete picture yet.
According to Politico, the committee has even interviewed at least one of the people charged with breaching the Capitol. First off, is that actually true? And if so, what have you learned about the motivations of the people who actually entered the Capitol building on January 6th?
We are not commenting for the most part on who we're bringing in and who we're not, for the reason that we want people to cooperate, and sometimes people are willing to cooperate as long as their confidentiality can be respected. And some of our sessions are an executive session, which we would have to have a vote to disclose information. So I can't comment on who precisely we've talked to. In terms of the motivations of the insurrectionists, I'll tell you, I was there on January 6th. I was there for the whole thing as these people attacked the Capitol Police and were breaking the doors in, breaking the windows to try to get into the House chamber. And one of the reasons why I'm so furious with those who are carrying this big lie of massive fraud in the last election is those insurrectionists, I think, for the most part, they believe the big lie. They believe the election had been stolen. They believe they were somehow justified in attacking the Capitol and beating police officers. But the people inside the chamber that I work with across the aisle understood it was a big lie and were content to tell it. And even after the police put down that violent attack on the Capitol, a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle still attempted, even with blood on the floor outside the chamber, still attempted to overturn the election by propagating the big lie. But we know that lie was at least a big motivation for many of the people who attacked the Capitol that day.
Representative Liz Cheney has floated the idea of amending the 1887 Electoral Count Act to prevent abuse during the election certification process. What is the Electoral Count Act, and is amending it necessary?
The Electoral Count Act was passed by Congress about a century and a half ago to try to send out the procedures for a contested election. That is, let's say a state sent 2 slates of electors, or what are the rules regarding when the House has to recognize or doesn't have to recognize a result coming from one of the states? How do you tally the votes in those kind of contested election situations? It's a very poorly written statute is the problem. And in the event that instead of the election coming down to 6 states, as it did in 2020, it comes down to a single state, and there's a dispute over how to count the votes in that single state, disputed that is in terms of the Congress's role, we want a statute to be crystal clear. And so I think there really is a need to revisit and rewrite provisions of the Electoral Count Act. The challenge is, can we get that passed? Or will one party believe that the changes somehow benefit one party or the other? We are working on a product that has support, I hope, from both conservative and liberal constitutional scholars. If we can succeed at that, then we may be able to pass reforms that would protect the country in the event of a legitimate dispute. Now, I have to say the dispute in 2020 was illegitimate. There was no evidence of massive fraud, and all the litigation brought by the Trump team was thrown out of court, and a lot of those lawyers are being faced with disciplinary charges by bar associations for pushing bogus claims. But it could very well be that in another election there could be legitimate claims that would need to be adjudicated by Congress, and we ought to have clear rules for that.
It's really interesting. We hear a lot about on the site the breakdown of federal power versus state power, and that seems to be a big issue with election law. And so finding a way that you don't infringe upon the states and their powers, but having a standard at the federal level that upholds what it's already trying to do is a really interesting way to address it. That we
and along those lines, one of my profound concerns going into the next 2 elections is there's an effort to strip independent elections officials around the country. This gets to the state level you're mentioning, to strip them of their duties and their powers and give them over to partisans. And that could be disastrous for the country, because there you could have succeed what failed in 2020, and that is an effort to overturn the results of an election in which the losing party simply wants to retain power or gain power. So those attacks on the meritocratic elections officials, some of whom are the subject of death threats now and being literally driven from their posts, are a clear and present danger to our democracy.
Last question. We spoke a couple of weeks ago with Representative Adam Kinzinger, who's also on your committee, and asked him if he was concerned that the investigation was biased or that would have the appearance of bias with only 2 Republicans on the committee. Do you share any of those concerns?
I don't. The 2 Republicans and Adam Kinzinger is probably too modest to blow his own horn. But both Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, I think, are doing an admirable job of following the facts. There's really no cross purposes on our committee. It's one of, I think, the bright lights in all of this dark time, and that is you do find at least one committee where Democrats and Republicans are working well with each other. Now we have a Republican leadership in Kevin McCarthy that didn't want the investigation to go forward at all because Donald Trump didn't want it to go forward for what may be pretty obvious reasons. And so we have this select committee vehicle, but the strength of our conclusions will rest on the quality of our work and the degree to which we're able to bring the public along through the course of public hearings. And I can tell you, I think we're doing extraordinarily well, moving very swiftly, and we're quite intent upon producing a report that should earn the public confidence.
Congressman Schiff, thank you so much as always for joining us on these ASB Chats.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate both of you putting together this platform and allowing people to discuss complicated issues in a very civil way. So thank you both for your work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.